Thank you, Donald, and good evening, everybody. Well, conference season has started, and kicking it off is the Trade Unions Congress, who've met in Brighton. And the biggest beast in the trade union jungle is the boss of the Unite Union, Len McCluskey. And he has said today that coordinated public sector industrial action on pay is very much on the cards over the course of the coming months. He's even said he would support strike action in the public sector, even if it was illegal, by which I mean that strike ballots need a 50% turnout for legal industrial action to go ahead. It's all about, of course, the pay cap, the 1% pay cap. Now, just to sort of go back over that, public sector pay was frozen for 2 years in 2010, except for those earning less than £21,000 a year. And since 2013, rises have been capped at 1% per annum below the rate of inflation. And do you remember, it was part of Theresa May's manifesto that they would keep public sector pay capped to 1%, but that kind of got them into trouble in the election campaign. And we all knew that at some point, before too very long, that was going to break. Well, it has broken today, and we are seeing pay rises for police officers and for the prison service of up 2%. But Len McCluskey wants more than that. He wants a 5% pay rise, and he wants that for nurses, teachers, council staff, civil servants, and for other workers too. And I'm asking you, would public sector strikes win your support? If workers on the picket lines tug at your heartstrings, then call me on 0345 6060 973. If you think strikes are a waste of time because the politicians aren't going to listen anyway and the public won't support them, then text to 84850. And I'm particularly keen to hear if you've ever been involved in a strike yourself and whether you think it actually did any good for you or not. And you can use the hashtag Farage at LBC and tweet at LBC. And of course, you can watch me live on Facebook from here inside the European Parliament in Strasbourg. And of course, you can also comment on Facebook Live too. So would public sector strike win your support at this moment in time? And Len McCluskey certainly flexing his muscles and feeling not just bullish about strike, but also about the Labour Party. And McCluskey talked about the traitors within the Labour Party who'd been proven wrong about the appeal of Jeremy Corbyn and his radical policies. Difficult, actually, to disagree with Len McCluskey because Corbyn has done very much better than many, including Tony Blair, thought that he would. So McCluskey feeling in a strong position, flexing his muscles, urging strikes. And I wonder, would you really support that? Wayne already on Facebook says, shake that money tree. Well, I don't think Len McCluskey's too worried about that. Stephen says, the USA doesn't have strikes. Well, they rarely do. But we have a long tradition of strikes. And just sort of have a quick think about the last 100 years or so. The period before the First World War, from 1910 to 14, was known as the Great Unrest. A wave of strikes, miners, railwaymen, dockers, and many others across the country. And some, I think, public sympathy for the way in which people were paid in those days. That continued, of course, right up until the general strike of 1926, a 10-day shutdown of nearly all public services in Britain. And we went on through the 30s, even during the war. Rolls-Royce struck during the war, something that made Churchill absolutely furious, as they, of course, were producing many of the engines that went into our fighter and bomber planes. But anybody old enough to remember the 1970s remembers a decade dominated by strike, beginning with the miners from 1972, and in the end, they actually brought the government down, leading Ted Heath to call a general election and to say, who governs Britain, me or the miners' union? And the public said, the miners' union, in the shape of the Labour Party. And it went on and led to that winter of discontent, 78, 79, and anyone that lived through it will remember the rubbish piling up, bodies not being buried. It was a mess. But that, of course, wasn't the end of it. We had the dramatic miners' strike in 1984, 85, and we go on having strikes all through this period, with firefighter strike and green goddesses happening as recently as 2002. But it's worth noting that over the course of the last year, strikes have increased. We've seen repeated strikes on the railways. We've seen a post office strike. We've seen a cabin crew strike. in British Airways. We've seen strikes of baggage handlers and many others. There's been a ratcheting up of strike over the course of the last year. But when Len McCluskey specifically calls for strike in the public sector, do you have sympathy? Well, interesting point to note is that in many ways, and I'm going to quote now Lord Lamont, the former Conservative Chancellor, who said just a couple of months ago, public sector pay is on average higher than in the private sector, even adjusted for qualifications. So there is a feeling out there that whilst it's pretty tough for many public sector workers who have been stuck with a 1% pay rise over the course of the last few years, there are many in the private sector who've seen their wages fall or not increase for 10 or in some case even 15 years. And my view is I never thought actually that this pay cap could go on forever. And I am pleased in a way that police and the prison service are getting better pay rises today. I've sympathy for people earning more money, but I do not think the country as a whole will have sympathy for public sector workers going on strike at this time, because there'll be many in the private sector saying, do you know what? You're being paid as well, if not better than us. Your pensions are pretty much guaranteed and ours are not. And I genuinely don't think those strikes would attract public support. Tell me I'm right. Tell me I'm wrong. Alan in Ballycastle is my first caller of the evening. Alan, good evening.
Good evening, Nigel. Pleasure to talk to you.
Pleasure to talk to you. And we get a lot of phone calls from Northern Ireland. We really do. Tell me, would you sympathise with public sector strikes, Alan, at this moment in time?
I think a public sector strike would be an absolutely brilliant idea, Nigel. And let me tell you why. As you know, we have a very large public sector. And I would be of the opinion that quite a lot of those people are performing jobs that have been created just for the simple reason of giving people jobs, and a bit of empire building by people at the top of the various branches of the civil service. So a civil service strike would be a fantastic way of finding out which civil servants were necessary and which weren't, and those that weren't necessary would then be got rid of.
Alan, that's a very interesting Machiavellian way of looking at it. So let the civil service strike, find out who we don't need, and then get rid of them. That's what you're saying, is it?
Correct. You'll know that whenever Brown was in charge, and Blair, of course, between 1997 and 2010, the civil service expanded by something like 20-25%. And quite a lot of it was specific job creation for the purpose just of giving jobs to people who, of course, would show their gratitude for their job by voting Labour.
So, Alan, you want us to cut back the size of the public sector, in particular the bureaucracy. Fine, Alan from Ballycastle, you've made your point. In the end, we got there. It was done in a rather clever, unusual way. I wonder what John in Mansfield thinks. John, would you support public sector strikes right now?
Definitely. By the way, evening, Nigel.
Good evening.
I was on strike in the firemen's strike in the 70s.
That was 77, was it? Yeah.
We'd had two inquiries into the pay, and the governments, both Labour and Conservative, would not implement the findings of the inquiries. So we went on strike, and we got a decent pay rise because of that. And after that strike, because the police were on the verge of walking out at the time, they gave the police a decent pay rise. And if I was still in the job today, I would be advocating a strike. And as regards the pension...
So, John, your experience of that fireman's strike in 77 is that actually it succeeded and government listened?
Yes, definitely.
And John, can I ask you, during that strike, did you feel that you had public support for what you're doing?
Definitely, most certainly.
Do you know, my memories of that are that actually people thought the firemen, as we now call them firefighters, I think, but the firemen were getting a rough deal. And I remember you did have very considerable public support. But John, my question to you is, today, with people in the private sector having had such a tough 10 years or so, would there be the same level of public sympathy for strike?
I think they would. I think
you think they would?
Yeah, and with regard to the pensions, nobody ever mentions what contributions the public sector make to pensions. Most of my service, I was paying 10.5% of my gross pay, and before I retired, it went up to 11%. And I think the fire brigade now are paying either 12 or 13%, matched by the employer. And I had 27.5 years in the fire service, and in 27.5 years, my contributions to the pension amounted to 7 years or thereabouts gross pay. So if the pension, which has now been capped at 1% for the last few years, they never told us that when we were paying 11% of our gross pay. And when people compare pensions, they want to compare what the employees have paid into those pensions.
Yeah.
And
John, I have to say...
Pardon?
I have to say, you've made both of your points superbly. Great call. Thank you. Well, Johnny Mansfield there, absolutely clear that all the way back in 77, when he was a fireman and they struck, not only did it work, because they had public support and government listened because it had to, but equally, that whilst public sector pensions are very good compared with the private sector, in many cases, the employees are putting in a lot of money. Right now, you're listening to the Nigel Farage Show, exclusively on LBC. It's 8:15. The leader of Britain's biggest trade union, Unite, Len McCluskey, known as Red Len to some, has said that industrial action in the public sector is very much on the cards. He would support strike, even illegal strike, over the coming month until public sector workers get a 5% pay increase. And this on the day when the government breaks its own manifesto pledge and pays prison officers and police workers up to 2% more. And we've talked a little bit about the history of strike. So we had a caller, John from Mansfield, who said that in 77, he was a fireman, he struck, there was great public support for the firemen of the day, and they won, and they got a much better deal. But in today's environment, would public sector strike win your support? Now, I'm keen, obviously, for you to ring me on 03456060973, to text me on 84850, to tweet using the hashtag Farage and LBC, at LBC, to comment on Facebook. But equally, I've also, just a few minutes ago, opened up a Twitter poll. Would a public sector strike win over your support? Yes or no? At Nigel_Farage or at LBC. So far, 1,000 of you in the last few minutes are playing the game. And at the moment, it's 37% that would support public sector strike and 63% that wouldn't. But, you know, on text I get from Linda, bring on the strikes. Nigel, instead of raising wages, how about the government stop pumping up house prices with quantitative easing and low rates and kill buy-to-let? Perhaps then the nurses and the like can buy a house. Craig, that may well be right, but unwinding the effects of QE would take years. What Len McCluskey is saying is they want action right now. There would be no public sector strike if wages went up the same as members of Parliament. So much for fairness. But it's difficult, actually, for me to disagree with that. My next caller with a view on this is going to be Tony in Whitechapel. Good evening.
Wow, the man, the myth, the legend, the one and only, Nigel Farage. What's happening?
Well, what's happening, Tony, is the leader of our biggest trade union is calling for widespread strikes. And I'm asking you, would you support that?
Well, like the government, they're full of guff, Nigel, and the referendum shows that. Let's look at 3 quick questions. Which way did the workers vote, really? The poor people, the workers, they voted to leave, right? When you look
do you know what, Tony? Do you know what, Tony?
Just let me get this out, otherwise I forget what I'm going to say.
Go on.
Which way did they vote?
Remain?
They voted to... Yeah.
Yep.
Which way did the unions vote?
The union leaders...
Well, they voted
the union...
to stay,
Yeah. The union leaders voted to stay, but many of the union members voted to leave. And it was...
That's what I'm saying. There's a gulf, isn't there, between them?
Oh, yeah.
So they're supposed to be protecting their workers against what? Whether it's the government, whether it's corporate, whatever it is. And they've gone completely the other way. So, to me, it's all just nonsense. No, it's all guff, mate, what's coming out of their mouth. So, I don't know. You explain it to me,
do you know,
mate,
Tony?
I don't know.
Yeah, do you know, Tony, you're quite right that traditionally, back to the 70s, the trade union movement were very worried about what the European project would do to British workers. They saw it as a political project that would support big corporations, would support big banks, and would do no good for the average working man or woman. One of the things that I've seen in all the years I've been here is a trail of trade union leaders coming over to Brussels and Strasbourg from the United Kingdom and loving it. Loving the lunches and the evenings out and being treated as being very, very important. And it was a great shame in many ways, a tragedy for his family. But Bob Crow, who led the RMT and was a friend of mine, and we may have differed completely on left and right politics, but Bob was absolutely root and branch opposed to our membership of the European Union, believing it to be bad for British workers. So, Tony, I'm with you. I think the trade union movement have somewhat sold out to this project. But back to my point, Tony, if you saw public sector strikes right now looking for a 5% pay increase, would that get your sympathy?
Yeah, because
it would.
of the work they do. I think they're the profound work. I've just seen 2 ambulance people coming up in my building today, and I'd nearly give them a round of applause, to be honest with you, because I think what they do is fantastic, mate. Absolutely fantastic.
Yeah. Well, Tony, I don't disagree with that. I've more than once in my life been in dire need of the ambulance services, and I have to say they do a remarkable job. Tony, thank you for your call, mate. Tony there, who would support strikes. He feels so important is the work many in the public sector do. I wonder what Barry in Leigh-on-Sea, who's never called LBC in his life before. Barry, good evening.
Hello, Nigel, and thank you for what you've done on the EU and Brexit. So, first off...
Well, thank you. Now, Barry, you've never called... Well, we'll see about that. Now, you've never called LBC before, so what is it about this debate, Barry? How strongly do you feel about public sector strikes right now?
Well, quite frankly, we've got police that don't actually bother to turn up to anything for days and days, if you call them, and they don't actually deserve the money they work for anyway, half of them. I know it's government-orientated on that side of it, but my point being, no, I don't support the strike side of it, because I think they're too important a bunch of workers to actually go on strike. But the point being, if you look at our council leaders, our CEOs in the council offices that are on over £250,000 a year, we should actually reroute the wealth, take the money away from them and actually give it to our public sector workers, the police, the nurses, army, etc., whoever obviously out there on the front line helping us. And I thought Mrs May was actually supposed to be dealing with all this side of things. I mean, currently the Essex CEO, Chief Executive of the Council, I think he's on about £295,000 a year.
Yeah. Well, this is one area,
councils throughout the country.
Barry. It's real money. Yeah. No, Barry, the one thing I think Len McCluskey and I might agree on this is that what happened under New Labour were those working in middle management and top management of our public services, whether it's through the health service, whether it's through particularly local government across the country, they had a New Labour bonanza. But it wasn't those down on the shop floor or on the wards that perhaps benefited in quite the same way. And I think Len McCluskey would agree with that. But, OK, Barry, right now then, if, the public sector, a large chunk of it, went on strike, it would not get your support, would it?
No, it wouldn't, because at the end of the day, I'm self-employed myself. And
yes,
if I want a pay rise, I'm sorry, but I don't actually get one, if you know what I mean. I mean, I'm probably one of the millions out there who is self-employed, who's probably earning less than the public sector are earning now. And if I put my prices up, I won't get to work.
Yeah. Barry, I think that's the point, and I think that's why I do not believe these strikes would get support. There are 5.3 million people now, like you, Barry, in Leigh-on-Sea, 5.3 million people who run their own businesses, are sole traders, are struggling with regulation and all the rest of it, and they and their families would certainly not support these strikes. I think overall they would struggle. Barry, thank you for calling LBC for the first time. Sean says, what other option do public sector workers have? The government are not listening. I will support them. Christopher says, the public sector workers are the backbone of the system. They deserve respect and the necessary increase to justify their job. Well, Christopher, I don't wholly disagree with that. But I'm not sure, I'm really not sure, that striking will actually help their cause. John says current pay structures are so unfair at the moment. Everyone needs a bit of a lift at the moment, not the stinking rich. Well, it's okay. I understand that, John. And again, the point is that the gap between average pay and the rich has got wider and wider and wider over the course of the last few years. And Margaret says our local council have just awarded themselves a 15% pay rise. What do you think of them? Following in the finest traditions of all political systems all over the world, says he, somewhat sarcastically. What does John in Hailsham think? John, would you support public sector strike?
I certainly wouldn't, Nigel. I think we have to appreciate, under the last Labour government, we did have open door immigration, which has probably gone a long way to destroying a lot of the wage structures for people in the private sector. And I think we have to also consider last year we had roughly a 4% increase in council tax. Obviously, if public sector workers receive a 5% increase, no doubt it will be reflected on a 5% increase again on our council tax. So anyone who's not in the public sector who won't be getting the 5%, well, obviously it's going to be seriously disadvantaged there, aren't they?
Well, you're right. And actually, just to give you some sort of fact on this, you look at seasonally adjusted average weekly earnings for regular pay in the public sector, it was £506 a week in April of this year, compared to £464 in the private sector. And the argument would go, you've got a great deal more job security in the public sector than you do in the private sector, and a much more reliable pension at the end of it, even though you may have to contribute a fair bit for it. So, John, I think, and I think one thing I'm seeing tonight, but I feel in general, I think there is overall terrific support for people who do great work in our public services. And I think, when the Tories said they would stick to the 1% pay cap, generally that got pretty much derided on day one. And we absolutely knew if they could form a government, that'd get broken. And we saw the beginnings of that today. So, John, there is sympathy for people earning a bit more, but I do not believe there is sympathy for them going on strike. Do you feel, John, a wave of strikes might be coming?
I think they may well be, but like I'm saying, I don't think they would get much public support. Obviously, we only got to look at the recent rail strikes we had. There was certainly no public support there. And I think obviously, everyone wants a pay rise, don't they? But someone's got to pay for it every time. No,
absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you. Very keen to hear also from many women that have been on strike, whether they think that worked or not. You're listening to the Nigel Farage Show here on LBC. It's 8:30 in Strasbourg, 7:30 in the UK. As trade union giant Len McCluskey calls for industrial action over the course of the next few months to boost public sector pay by 5%, I'm asking you, would such strikes in the public sector win your support and approval? And you're calling the number and you're texting. And there's also the Twitter poll. You can play the game on the Twitter poll by going to @Nigel_Farage and @LBC. Would you support public sector strikes? And I'll read out the result before the top of the hour. Now, anyone listening this morning to the news, particularly the business news, would have heard that inflation has risen to 2.9%. Yet more doom and gloom. Indeed, if you listen to the BBC, you would think our economy is falling off the edge of a cliff and disaster is overtaking our nation because of Brexit. Well, allow me, please, to give you a Brexit business briefing. The Office of National Statistics, released in August, show that tourism in the UK is up 7% on the last year, with 3.5 million visitors coming in June, helped by the value of sterling. Americans seem particularly keen. There was a 35% increase on the previous June. Meanwhile, on the high street, the British Retail Consortium reported earlier this month that retail sales for August were 2.4% higher than they were the previous August, and online sales of non-food products grew by an impressive 11% in August as well. On the market, FTSE is significantly up since the result of the referendum, 20%. But more significantly, the FTSE 250, which represents British businesses and not international global ones, is up by 30% since the referendum. In manufacturing, the steady fall in the pound, which began in 2010, long before the Brexit vote, has improved our competitiveness. For example, in the East Midlands, calculated by Lloyds Bank, August this year saw new orders for businesses in the region grow at their fastest rate for 3 years, and order backlogs rose at their highest rate in 16 years. And at the beginning of this month, a report from the manufacturing group, EEF, said that more companies are seeing output and orders increase than at any time since 1995. Indeed, the chief economist at EEF said manufacturers appear to have taken the recent political upheaval in their stride and are taking advantage of growing world markets to make hay while the sun shines. And you'll notice that since last year, the number of people in employment has risen by 338,000, with unemployment down. Interestingly, employment in London's private sector rose at the fastest rate for the last 18 months in August of this year. And the euro's relative strength against the pound has been great news for companies sourcing components from British manufacturers. But a slight warning, sterling has rallied sharply. Sterling is now over 10% up. Yes, up against the dollar, and it traded at 133 today. So maybe the real business boom that we've had with low sterling may be coming towards an end. And finally, yesterday we heard that London has maintained its position as the world's #1 global financial centre by extending its lead over New York, Hong Kong and Singapore in the Z-Yen index. Surprisingly, the London Evening Standard failed to put this on their front page. Perhaps it's something to do with their editor, the former Chancellor of the Exchequer, George Osborne, an ardent Remainer. So, folks, there is plenty of good, positive news out there. But as I say, you will not get it from the BBC. Or, frankly, almost anywhere out there on broadcast media. But here on LBC, you will, and I intend to keep you up to date with regular Brexit business briefings. But back to the trade union movement, back to the call for public sector strike, back to the idea of would you, the public, support public sector strike at this time? And I'm not actually saying would you support an increase in pay so much, because many would, though many wouldn't. Lazio makes the point, moaning about a 1% pay rise and a bonus. My pay has been capped for the last 5 years. They should think themselves lucky. Lots of people working in the private sector saying they're earning actually the same or less than they were 10 years ago. Now, first-time caller to this show is Paul on the Wirral. Paul, good evening.
Hi, Nigel. How are you? You okay?
Yeah, I'm fine. So would you back strikes, Paul?
Yeah, I mean, I used to work in the civil service. I wouldn't necessarily back the strikes. However, there's a couple of points I would make. First point would be, with the pay cap over the last, obviously, sort of 4 years where it's been frozen for lower paid workers, and obviously George Osborne's introduction of the national living wage, the actual wage differential now between civil servants, especially at the lower end, and other sectors of the economy has actually narrowed a lot. So I think actually when you actually raise the minimum wage and the living wage, it's going to have a knock-on effect. And that's what's fueling, I think, some of the desire for increases now in this, in the public sector, because they've obviously probably noticed their wages actually have declined, maybe relative to those in the private sector. However, I do take on board, obviously, the fact that the pensions obviously are more generous.
And Paul, also, job security is better too, isn't it?
It is. However, I mean, there is obviously austerity isn't just in the public sector at the moment. It's not necessarily just about capping on wages. There is actually, HMRC. There is actually a proposed reduction in staff numbers, and obviously you may have heard they're looking to consolidate a lot of regional offices now into these new super centres. They're trying to basically fit X amount of people into a much smaller building. It's there is going to be job losses. Obviously, they've said it's going to be through natural wastage, etc., etc. However, I think the union has said more than likely there's going to be redundancies. So it's not necessarily as, there is a bit of a myth sometimes of public sector job is a job for life. However, I'm not necessarily sure that's the case at the moment. I will just add second point quickly. We talk about sort of the lower paid end of the civil service public sector, and I think there is a case for them to get a pay rise. I'm not necessarily sure that justifies a strike. Look at the higher end though of the public sector. I mean, for example, HMRC, there was former head Lynn Homer, named by the Mail as Dame Disaster. I think it'd be fair.
I remember.
She's got a mixed track record, yet she was getting a bonus of X amount each year. And then I think when you're a civil servant and you see somebody like that getting a pay rise, taking the work that other people do, you start to think, well, why aren't we getting a pay rise?
But for people on average wages, Paul, in the public sector, and you've been there, do you think a pay rise of up to 5% is justified?
I'm not sure about the 5%. I mean, is that what Len McCluskey is called for?
Well, that's what Len McCluskey is calling for, and I have to say, I think given the fact we're still running at a huge deficit, I think that call is over the top. But I think, Paul, the general feeling that, after years of being kept at 1%, a little bit of a pay increase, a bit of a morale boost would be a good thing. I think that has generally a fair bit of support. But, Paul, I genuinely don't think that if our public services go on prolonged strike action, they're going to win public sympathy. Do you?
I think a strike is probably it should be the last resort. I think, there should be negotiation first. Yeah.
Okay.
If they could go for something maybe 2%, 1%, something to show.
Yeah.
It's been in real terms over the last 5 years. It would improve morale, and obviously, we need motivated public servants as well.
We certainly do. No, I agree. I agree, Paul, and I thank you. No, I thank you very much for your call. And I'm going to go to Shepton Mallet now, to Lucy, another first-time caller. Lucy, good evening.
Good evening, Nigel. How are you?
I'm well. So tell me, from Shepton Mallet, would you support public sector strike?
Absolutely, I would support it. Years ago, we always used to support people who went on strike. I remember as a child being asked to support various people who've gone on strike. I wish people would remember that people will only go on strike as a very, very last resort when they have tried to negotiate with their employers or whomever. And it's not easy going on strike. It's not easy for anyone. It's not a decision that's taken lightly by anyone, and I do support them 100%.
Yeah. Have you any experience, Lucy, of strikes in your family or amongst your friends?
I have been on strike personally 3 times with the company that I work for. And I know full well what it's like to go on strike. No one wants to do it. Everyone feels terrible about doing it. They realise the consequences of going on strike for members of the general public. But as I say, it really is a last resort when you've come to the bitter end of negotiations and you're not going anywhere. I have to say, I don't think at the end of the day it really achieves anything for anyone.
No. That's the point, Lucy, I was asking. You've done it 3 times. Have you, as a result of all that, been better off or not?
Not particularly, no. Not particularly. I don't think it really, as I say, it's not really nobody wins. The company you're working for has a reputation damage. You don't really achieve anything. You lose money by going on strike, and at the end of the day, I think the consequences in the end are still the same. The company will do whatever they want.
Yeah, well, probably overall true. Lucy, thank you. In a minute, I will talk about some of my thoughts about strikes that I've seen in my lifetime and the effect that they've had. Right now, though, you're listening to the Nigel Farage Show exclusively on LBC. It's 8:45 here in Strasbourg and 7:45 in London. I'm asking you, would you support public sector strike at this moment in time as the leader of Britain's biggest union, Len McCluskey, calls on industrial action, try and get a 5% pay increase for people in the public sector? And that question you're texting and tweeting, but we're also having a Twitter poll on this. As I said earlier, I'm simply asking, would you support public sector strike? And that poll closes at 5 to 8. If you want to get involved, get there quickly. You can go to @Nigel_Farage and @LBC, and I'll give you the result at the end of the show. Thousands of you are voting on it as we speak. My experience of strike, the one that I felt the most strongly about, was the National Union of Mine Workers strike, led by Arthur Scargill in 1984. I took the view that he was a Marxist, that he wanted to bring down effectively Western civilization. I thought he was a very dangerous man. I thought he had to be beaten. He said the government will close down our industry completely. And he was beaten. And he was beaten partly because in Nottinghamshire, the Union of Democratic Mine Workers broke away under a man called Roy Link. They broke away because they too felt that the Scargill strike was simply too political. They broke away. They suffered terrible abuse in many of their communities. They then went on to break every coal target production record that had ever been seen in this country. And yet, in 91-92, John Major and Michael Heseltine closed down all of those pits. And I felt desperately sorry for those people who'd broken away and done the right thing. And the Conservatives to effectively have closed all those pits because we were buying subsidised Polish coal, I thought was awful. Also made me think maybe just maybe, Arthur Scargill had been right all along. So I do have sympathy, for trade unions that are trying to do the right thing. I don't have sympathy for trade unions who would do this for simply political reasons. John is calling me from Stoke-on-Trent. John, good evening.
Hello, Nigel. How are you?
I'm well. You're on LBC, John. You've not called us before. No, not at all. We like a mixture of first-time callers and people who've been on before. But, John, what motivated you to call the number tonight?
So I've been working in an industry that's probably not got the best reputation ever. Don't judge me, I'm a recruitment consultant. And
they're even more unpopular. They're even more unpopular than MEPs, John. I mean, this is serious, you know.
I know that very well. And despite popular opinion, it's not all fast cars, high wages, and Friday nights in the pub. It's actually very, very hard work. I get to work at sort of 8:30, 8 o'clock in the morning. I rarely leave before 7. My annual salary has not risen since, for about 5-6 years now. And at the end of the day, I did vote to leave the European Union, and I know a lot of things that are happening in this current economy, austerity and all that kind of thing, but we're all in this together, guys. And I think at the end of the day, my wages haven't risen. My pension, my company gives me 2%, which is paltry. Whereas, the public sector, they get a hell of a lot more than that, and, they match it themselves. And in real terms, they're earning a hell of a lot more than what we are. And I just don't think it's fair.
No, well, I think that is an opinion, John, that is pretty widely held. And when you say we're all in this together, well, that's what Osborne and Cameron said, and I'm not sure people quite believe that anymore. They look at the pay rises for MPs. We saw a local council awarding themselves big pay rises. And I think, John, generally, there's a feeling that we're not all in this together. But I think the points you make about, public-private sector, I think they're very good ones. John, I thank you very much indeed for your call. Good evening, Nigel. I think public sector strikes are political. The unions are just trying to frustrate the government by being disruptive, says BB. The public sector pay freeze can be traced back to Tony Blair and Gordon Brown's government. As Gordon couldn't understand simple arithmetic, we are now in our present mess, says Richard. Richard, they're referring to the fact that we are running very big budget deficits still every single year. For those striking and don't support Brexit, there are plenty of people in the EU ready to take your jobs. Be careful of what you wish for, says Ollie. No sympathy for the strike because Corbyn is doing it for political gain and trying to stop Brexit. The Labour Party left us broke and even sold off our bullion, says Joe in London. I know they did. And they sold it off for $280 an ounce. 400 metric tons of it. It's now $1,300 an ounce. And in the intervening period, it's been to $2,000. Don't start me as a former metals trader on Gordon Brown's sale of gold. But back to where we are. Would you support public sector strike going on right now in the UK? John in Folkestone, would they have your support?
No, they wouldn't. They would not have my support. Unfortunately, the people in the private sector don't have the luxury of going on strike because if they went on strike, their companies would go bust. But in the public sector, of course, they can strike away. Their company will always be there thanks to the good old taxpayer. The people in the public sector have gold-plated pensions. We have pension apartheid in this country. Public sector pensions are running at 1.7 trillion unfunded pensions, straight off the top of the taxpayer. I think in the NHS alone, it's 10 billion every year spent on their pensions, unfunded, straight off the taxpayer. And apart from that, public sector get all the fringe benefits, sick holiday, good redundancy packages, and so on, early retirements, and most definitely I do not support any strike in the public sector as it stands.
John, I don't think you could have put the point or the case any more clearly than that, and I do understand where you're coming from. I would ask you, though, John, are there circumstances in which you would support increased pay for, ambulance workers or nurses or whatever it may be?
Well, I'm dead against this, this 5% across the board and all that. I think if anything, it should be selective, because if they save 5% across, but that's no good. What we want is, if let's say, is it a £10 a week for nurses, or it should be. Well, it's like going back to the 70s, this, isn't it? I mean, that's
and we don't, and John, that was a nightmare, and we don't want to go there. John in Folkestone making his point very, very clearly. I thank you very much for the call. The Twitter poll asking, would you support public sector strike has now closed. Results coming at the end of the show. And my last caller this evening is going to be Jordan, who's calling from Kings Lynn. Jordan, good evening.
Hello, Mr. Farage. You're a legend, must I say.
That's very kind of you, Jordan, but not necessarily helpful for this debate.
No,
so
you know what? I don't agree. I don't agree with the strikes. I think it's a joke. Like they get a percentage pay rise. Like they should count themselves lucky, really.
And do you work in the private sector, Jordan?
Yeah, I'm a construction worker. Yeah.
Yeah,
I don't get a pay rise. Do you know what I mean? If I don't work, do you know what I mean? I don't get money, so I don't get no pension. I've got to sort my own things out. I think it's a joke. Like they know they've got the government where they've got them, and it's just stupid, really.
Right. Okay, Jordan. Can I ask you, Jordan, what's happened to your pay over the course of, say, the last 10 to 15 years?
I got a pay rise 8 years ago.
Right.
That was the last pay rise I received.
Right, so no pay rise for you.
In real terms, I'm making a pay. Like, I'm not getting a pay rise. In real terms, I'm losing money.
Yeah, and that's been the case actually right throughout the construction industry, hasn't it?
Yeah, it has.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So no sympathy for strikes from Jordan. Jordan making it absolutely clear he would not support public sector strikes. Well, thousands of you, 3,500 of you, got involved in the last 50 minutes on the Twitter poll, and to the proposition, would you support public sector strikes? 37% said yes, and 63% said no. And I think that is pretty representative of the calls, texts, tweets, and Facebook messages that we went through over the course of the last hour or so. I think whilst there is great sympathy for the great work that many in the public sector do, and whilst I do understand the arguments about changes to minimum wage and all the rest of it, actually I think people out there that work in the private sector, or families related to or retired people from the private sector, will say actually, as it stands right now, people in the public sector are actually earning on average more money than those in the private sector, with better job security and with better pensions too. You've been listening to the Nigel Farage Show on LBC. I'm back tomorrow evening from 7, but tomorrow morning, of course, I'll be here in this wonderful cathedral to European integration, listening to Jean-Claude Juncker giving his State of the Union speech. Oh, I'll get a chance to reply too. Coming up at 10 tonight is Ian Collins, but up next, it's Clive Bull.
Nigel, thanks very much indeed. Coming up later at 9, it's the Health Hour. Dr. Sarah Jarvis is here answering your medical queries. A giant fat